apologies, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's the author of the book that give best given a memoir, no other than Mr. Edward the Gangi. Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Edward.
Daniel, thank you very much for inviting me to join you. I appreciate it.
Yes, and can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Edward DeGangi, and I live here in the United States in North Carolina. We like in North Carolina like to think we are the United States writingest state, and I live in a town called Hillsborough, and we like to think that we are the writingest town in the writingest state. We do have some wonderful and very well-known authors here. I've been living here now with my wife for about 11 years, and I am retired. And back in 2017, I embarked on a project to find the identity of the woman who had placed me for the adoption at the time of my birth back in 1948. And that search evolved into my book, The Gift Best Given, a memoir.
Sounds interesting, Mr. Edward. So, what age did you realize that you're good in writing?
I remember all the way back into elementary school submitting some very poorly written things. There was a magazine called Boy's Life here in the United States, and it served the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts, and I sent 3 or 4 pieces to them. I think probably handwritten in pencil on a scrap of paper, and I was not surprised to get them back to me saying, "Try again some other time." But I think I really came to believe that I had the ability to write well somewhere around middle school. And then in high school, we used to have summer reading projects, and we would then have to complete a project when we started that year's school. And we had a new teacher, and he came into class one day after we had submitted our projects, and he said, "I think the only person in this class who submitted anything worthwhile was," and he gave my name, and I that sort of set me on the course of feeling very confident about my writing, even though I did little creative writing after that for some time.
Wow. Very interesting, Mr. Edward. So, who are your favorite authors that influence you the most?
Um, I think of the contemporary authors right now, my favorite is Michael Cunningham, who wrote the book called The Hours, which was made into an Academy Award-winning film. And two others from the second half of the 20th century would have been Philip Roth and John Updike were very influential. I've read probably about 25 of Philip Roth's 32 books.
Wow. So, Mr. Edward, if you describe the writing of Mr. Roth or whatever your favorite author is, what is it or what are they?
I think they are very strong in setting a sense of place. You always know where you are in these books, and you can literally smell and feel and touch what's going on where the characters are placed, and also just the remarkable detail. And there's also a little, particularly with Philip Roth, there's always a little bit of cynical humor in there, a dry sense of humor, and I appreciate that.
Very well said, Mr. Edward. So, what are your short term and long term goals in writing?
Well, my two goals right now, on the short term, is I continue to do marketing and publicity for the gift best given. And for those who have not written a book or are just writing your first book, if you're serious about marketing the book, it will take a lot of time away from writing the second book. But the second book is also my long-term goal, and it is basically a sequel to The Gift Best Given.
Wow, good luck for this upcoming book, Mr.
Well,
Edward. So before we go on, Mr. Edward, I want to shout out to the people listening in the United States, most especially in the state of North Carolina, where you said the capital writers in the United States. And thank you, North Carolina. In Huntersville, I get 65% audience there. Henderson 5%, Asheville at 3%, Roanoke Rapids at 2%, Waxhaw at 2%, Charlotte at 2%, Cary at 2%. I have 40 places in North Carolina. Sorry if I cannot read them all, but from the bottom of my heart, North Carolina, thank you for those 42 places for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created in Power Writers all over the world, like Mr. Edward D. Gangi. Mr. Edward, the Give Best Given, a memoir. How did you crafted it?
well, actually, I should say I started this project without any intention of writing a book. As I said, I was adopted at the time of my birth. Back in 2017, there was an event that triggered me to decide it was finally time to go and identify who the woman was who had placed me for adoption. And I started down that path, and I was very fortunate in that I made some very quick progress. I was also fortunate in that I found out that my mother had a very, very interesting and exciting career. And I had a good friend who I would routinely have coffee with in the morning. And every time I would come and tell him about what I discovered next and what I had done, he kept on saying, "You really need to write a book. You really need to write a book." And ultimately, I had enough in hand where I said, "You know what? I think he's right." And I started writing in two pieces. One was the pieces about my search. What had I done on at a particular time to learn? And the other pieces were, I guess, creative nonfiction, in that I was telling my mother's story. I was telling what I discovered, and I knew where she was and who she was with and when she was there. The only thing I didn't know is precisely what was said at those times, and that's the creative pieces. I filled in dialogue in many of those situations.
Mr. Edward, what inspired you to write the Give Best Given, a memoir?
Well, again, it was the interesting discoveries that I made and what I was learning, and it just felt like it was a story that should be told. To give credit to my wife where it's due, she always knew that I was adopted, and routinely would say, "Why don't you do a DNA test? Maybe you'll find something out. Why don't you look harder? We can hire a detective. Maybe you'll find something out." And I just never had the inclination. I had had a wonderful upbringing with my adoptive parents, but as I said, one day there was just an event, and I said, if it will ever happen, this is the time.
Can you describe the research process behind the Give Best Given?
Yes, and I think, the important thing there is, I think, perhaps some of my delay early on was that we didn't have access to things as we do today with the internet. But I had a great benefit in that my adoption had been privately arranged, and my adoptive mother, even though she had passed away, 30 years prior, had kept my adoption decree. And that adoption decree had my adoptive parents' names on it. It had their attorney's name on it, and a name I did not recognize. And just intuitively, I knew it had to be my birth mother. It had to be the person who was giving me up for adoption. So,
Oh,
so my first stop was at my local library, and I went in there and I got on the ancestry.com site, and I typed in her name, and I sat there. I hesitated for a while and said, "Do you really want to go down this path?" And yes, I did. And I entered some information. I get a screen full of information back, and I there were census records and some other legal documents, and I went to the one that was the closest to my birth date. I was born in May of 1948, and there was a document which was dated March of 1949. So I thought this is only 10 months. Perhaps there's something interesting there. And when I clicked on it, it was a visa application written in Portuguese for my mother to travel from Miami, Florida to Rio de Janeiro. And it had some information with her address on it, her parents' names on it, her birth date on it. I had always assumed she was a high school girl, but no, she was 23 years old when I was born. And it also had a picture of her, which was really an eye opener for because I just never thought much about what it was that she would look like. And there's a screen full of face just staring back at me, and I'm thinking that's my mother.
Oh, wow, interesting indeed,
S-
Mr. Edward. And according to Miss Paget Gerler,
y-
the best gift, the ultimate sacrifice. So, Mr. Edward, what are the ultimate sacrifices that you shared to the book?
Do you know what? My sacrifices were very minimal. I spent a lot of time with it, certainly. I spent a good deal of money. I independently published, but I paid a cover designer and a book formatter and an editor. So there were monetary sacrifices, but the title itself, The Gift Best Given, really refers to what a woman does when they relinquish a child for adoption. And the title itself came out of a conversation that occurs in the book between my birth mother and a woman who sort of stepped in a maternal role to my mother, and he was a sounding board and gave her advice. And my mother was saying the greatest gift that I was given was my ice skating career. She was a celebrity performer in the big ice skating shows in her era. And she said, and you're telling me that this child who is totally unexpected to me is a gift. And the woman basically responds, well, sometimes the best gift is the gift that you give to somebody else. And I
Y-
think the message there was maybe you want to consider, taking your baby and placing him in somebody else's hands.
Yes, and according to Mrs. Stacy and Hawks, a journey of discovery, family, and connection. So, Mr. Edward, what are the elements that you put in your memoir that make the readers glued to it?
Well, I think there's a sense of suspense. You're waiting to see what happens next, and what decision did my mother make, and afterwards, what did she do. It also talks about my search for her, and unfortunately I found that she was no longer alive, but then it transformed into a search for a maternal half brother I knew who was out there. And then meeting with him and having to convince him that his mother, who he held on a pedestal and just worshiped, had 8 years before he was born had an illegitimate child. So there's some of that. The other part is by total surprise, I discovered who my birth father was, and that's not something that I'd spent a lot of time thinking about. And I met a paternal half brother as well, and there was an interesting story surrounding that as well. And I think there's a lot of people relate a great deal to my birth mother. She was a well-regarded person in real life and among her family and friends, and it comes through in the book, and people really feel attached to that.
And according to Miss Rita C. Berman, a search results in a well written book. Mr. Edward, the gift of best given. Do you have another title of your memoir?
Well, I if I were to put a another subtitle on it, I would say it is a story of adoption, search, discovery, and reunion. I never thought of another title per se for the book, but I've thought for a number of possible subtitles.
Oh, yes, interesting, Mr. Edward. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our third season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the best restaurants in downtown Toronto. And please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about Thanksgiving. People, Thanksgiving, because in Canada we are celebrating Thanksgiving on the 9th of October. So please do listen. And plus one more, our books are out. Not only one, but 7 volumes, people. Food 101, Volume 1 Basics is all you need to create a delicious food. Available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So, Mr. Edward, the Give Best Given, a memoir. What is the best highlight?
I think depending on who you spoke to, you would find a different answer. But my favorite highlight is in my search, I discovered a couple, a man and a woman who were antique dealers, and they had been at an auction in Atlanta, Georgia in 2012. And when I discovered their blog that was online, it had about half a dozen photographs of my mother, her first professional contract, her middle school diploma, and they explained that they had no idea who she was, but she was a glamorous woman from a glamorous era. And I reached out to them thinking, okay, this is 5 years later. Will they still have those materials? And remarkably, they did. And and they said, you need to come here right now. And we're in North Carolina and they were in Georgia. But about a week later, we drove down there. And I think one of the kindest things somebody has ever done to me, they came in with this big carton of materials, photographs and scrapbooks and documents. And as I was looking through it, they just sort of slowly pushed the carton across the table at me and said, "This is yours. We've just been holding it for you." And they became a part of the process at that point, and they've become very valued friends to us. We think very highly of them, and certainly a lot of what I've learned, I probably would not have learned or not have learned as quickly was it not for them.
Very well said, Mr. Edward. So, what's the most rewarding aspects of being an author?
Well, I think it's twofold. It's number one, what you learn, and number two, it's the interaction with your readers. I know some writers just like to write, and the last thing they want to do is go out in public and talk about their books. I love that opportunity. And I love to get out with the readers and talk about the story, talk about the book. And invariably, when I'm done, at least one or two people will come up to me and tell me about their own experience with adoption. And the ones who have already read the book will tell me in some manner how the book has impacted them in a positive way. And that's a very rewarding thing.
How do you feel about the current state of the publishing industry, especially with the rise of self publishing and digital platforms?
I'm a total supporter. I When I wrote my book, I really didn't know much about the self-publishing industry. I knew it was kind of looked down on. And my thought was, well, I'm going to get an agent and I'm going to sell my book to a big publisher and I'm going to get an advance. And after 83 pitches to agents and only 3 positive responses, and then those did not pan out, I said, my life is fairly short and I don't have time to do this. And I really educated myself on the self publishing process. And that's the road that I went down. And I When I finish my sequel, I have no thoughts about going to traditional publishing. I will go right back to self publishing. And I think a lot of people, at least in the United States, think the only avenue they have is Amazon. And there are many avenues. They talk about going wide so your book can wind up in many places. And that's what I've done. And I've got books on Amazon. I've got the book on Amazon, but I have it in bookstores, in libraries, and that's all the result of a real studied approach of how to approach it. I think, the digital platforms and self-publishing have have created a great opportunity for people, but the public is getting picky. They want quality product.
Yes. So the gift best given a memoir. If you want to go back and revise the book itself, which part of the book you want to revise?
Probably somewhere toward the end of the book, because I've got a couple of open. I thought my story was complete when I finished it, but I subsequently in New York. I was born in New York State, and New York State's birth records were closed at the time that I wrote the book. Shortly after publishing it, they opened up adoption records to adoptees, and I was able to get a copy of my original birth certificate. And it was very interesting in that all of the information contained on the document was erroneous. My mother's name was stated incorrectly, her address was stated incorrectly, her occupation was housewife rather than performer. And I know that it was done with the purpose to keep her, for the purposes of discretion, to protect her identity. And I would like to go back and tell that story a little bit, of what that birth certificate meant, and if I had started my search with that document in hand, I might still be searching.
Oh, wow. Interesting, Mr. Edward. But if you go back and give advice to yourself when you were first starting out as a writer, what would it be?
Boy, that's such a good question. I think I probably would have engaged a developmental editor a little bit early on in the process. When I was done with my manuscript, I essentially had two piles of paper. One was the writing I did about my search, and the other was the story that I told about my mother. And the only thing I could see was, well, let me tell my story first, and then in section two, we'll tell her story. And when I finally and I puzzled over that, it just didn't feel right, but I didn't know what to do with it. And when I finally turned the manuscript over to my editor, who I hired late in the game, she came back to me and said, I need to make a suggestion to you, and I think will make a big difference. And she suggested taking those two piles and kind of shuffling them like a deck of cards, so that there would be the first piece of my search and the first thing I discovered about her, the second piece of my search and the next thing I discovered about her. And it was a simple suggestion, but I think it was brilliant, and I'm embarrassed it just didn't dawn on me from the start. But that would have saved me a lot of hand wringing, trying to think of how will this really move out.
But before we go on, people, I'm inviting you to grab a copy of my latest climate change book, One Earth, Our Changing Climate and What We Can Do About It. Grab a copy, available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So repeat, One Earth, Our Changing Climate and What We Can Do About It. So people, let's support this book because this book talks about how we tackled climate change nowadays. We need to participate to combat climate change. This is for our generations to come. So, Mr. Edward, according to Dana, A magical story with a happy ending. What are the elements that you put in the story to make this memoir magic?
Well, the story itself was magic. I really didn't need to insert too much. I think it came to a happy ending because I discovered the identity of my mother, and I discovered a woman who was quite accomplished and who paid a very significant price for my happiness and my success. I she had her own successes, obviously, and many people, you know, relate to her very, very much. Um, I think people also relate to the fact that I did ultimately meet my both my maternal and my paternal half brothers. So it was a sense of, of increasing family through this search. And there were really no negative events. And this is sometimes rare with adoption. Sometimes you find your family of origin and nobody wants anything to do with you. They call it secondary rejection. I met cousins and they basically reached out their arms and they embraced me and they were happy to see me. My maternal half brother, while he took some convincing, once he was convinced was just fine. And my paternal half brother said, I always wanted a brother. I'm glad you're here. So it was, I it's a happy story in the end. And not every story is that way. But I was very fortunate that mine was. And I think I conveyed that and I think I told that well.
Very well said, Mr. Edward. What books or author are you currently reading or recommend?
I just finished a book by James McBride called The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. And James McBride is just a brilliant author. He wrote a book called The Color of Water, which really put him on the map. And it was a memoir, and not unlike the way that my book finally rolled out. But Heaven and Earth Grocery Store kind of tells a story about a very mixed community in Pottstown, Pennsylvania in the 1930s, and the relationships between the Christians and the Jews and the blacks all living together. And it's a brilliantly told story, and his language is just so beautiful. And I just finished that a couple of days ago.
Yes, highly recommended, right, Mr.
I
Edward?
certainly do.
Where can our listeners find more about you and your work?
I have a website, and the website is digangiauthor.com. So that's Digan like Nancy, GI author.com. And it has information about myself, about the book, uh, a list of media things, listing of podcasts such as this, uh, upcoming events. And so there's a lot there. You can also purchase the book there in any number of forms. It's in soft cover. It's now in hardcover with dust jacket. It's in large print, and it's available as an ebook. So they can be ordered there, or the book is available, as your book is worldwide via Amazon and the other major online retailers. The book is also available in most libraries here in the US, either as an ebook form on either Libby or on Hoopla. So if somebody doesn't want to invest in purchasing the book but wants to read it, most libraries should have it available in one of those forms.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Edward because if you support him, more books to come.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad to hear that you have so many North Carolina listeners.
Yes, I have 42 places in North Carolina.
Shout out to them. As they said, North Carolina is the country's reading state.
Yes, the reading state.
That's correct.
Again, North Carolina. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world. So, Mr. Edward, thank you for your time.
Daniel, thank you so much for the invitation, and I really enjoyed chatting with you. Daniel, thank you. I really appreciated the opportunity to talk with you.
And listen notes. Thank you for my latest scores of 26 and belong to 10% popular show globally. Modicon people, see you soon.